Hello and welcome back. Today is December 4th, 2024. It's Wednesday, and we are reading chapter 20. Oh gosh, no. We're reading chapter. What chapter are we reading, Raisin? I don't even remember. Now Zoe wants to come in. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. We're reading chapter 28 of Lirael by Garth Nix today. That didn't last long. Ray's outside now because he got mad that Zoe was outside the door and Claudine chased her away. So she's in her room eating now. My son is in his room watching TV. And I'm going to get ready to read this long chapter. We've got a couple of really long chapters coming up here, so I'm going to try to read earlier to make sure that these big files upload the way they're supposed to before 8 p.m. So, heard a little voice tell me today that, Jerica, you've done more this year than you've done any year since you were a kid. So it's time to rest. And I'm going to heed that message and get this chapter uploaded. And then I'm going to try to rest today and see what other magical messages the universe has in store for me, because I think it's that time of year that I have to listen to my body because it's getting dark so early. And if I keep pressing on, I'm going to make myself sick. So that has helped me decide what I'm going to do as far as what book I'm going to read next. I'll let you know in a few days what I've decided and what I'm going to be doing with the rest of the year. So, anyways, let's start reading chapter 28. It's going to be really good. So, let's get started. I need some tea. Okay. Chapter 28. Sam the Traveler. Elamir did intercept Sam, so the rest of his day was lost to Petticourt, the sentencing of a thief who tried to lie, despite the truth spell turning his face bright yellow with every falsehood, the arbitration of a property dispute that defied any hard and fast truths, as all the original parties were dead, the rapid processing of a series of petty criminals who confessed immediately, hoping that not having to bespell them would improve the court's outlook, and a long and boring speech from an advocate, which turned out to be irrelevant, as it relied on a point of law overturned by Touchstone's reforms more than a decade ago. The night, however, was not taken up by official duties, though Elamir once again produced a younger sister of one of her thousands of friends to sit next to Sam at dinner. To her surprise, Sam was quite talkative and friendly, and for days afterwards she defended him when other girls told tales of his distance. After dinner, Sam told Elamir that he would be studying for the next 3 days and had to immerse himself in a spell that required total concentration. He would get food and water from the kitchens, and then would be in his bedchamber and must not be disturbed. Elamir took the news surprisingly well, which made Sam feel bad, but even that could not curb his growing excitement, and the long hours creating a very basic sending of himself did not diminish his sense of expectation. When he finished it, at a little past midnight, the sending looked quite like him from the door, though it had no depth from other angles, and if it was spoken to, it could shout, "Go away!" and "I'm very busy," in a fair imitation of his voice. With the sending done, Sam went to his workroom and picked up his ready money and some of the things he had made, which might prove useful for the journey. He did not look at the cupboards, which stood like disapproving guardians in the corners of the room, but he dreamed of them when he finally got to bed. He dreamed that he climbed the stairs again and opened the cupboards and put on the bandolier of bells and opened the book and read words that burst into fire, and the words picked him up and swept him into death, plunging him into the cold river and he couldn't breathe. He woke, thrashing in his bed. The sheets tangled around his neck, cutting off his air. He fought them in a panic till he realized where he was, and his heart began to slow from its frenzied pumping. Off in the distance, a clock struck the hour, followed by the shouts of the watch, announcing all was well. It was 4 o'clock. He had only 3 hours' sleep, but he knew he could sleep no more. It was time to cast the glamour upon himself. Time for Sam the Traveler to take his leave. It was still dark when Sam slipped out of the palace, in the cool morning, just before the dawn. Cloaked in charter spells of quiet and unseen, he slipped down the stairs, past the guard post in the southwest courtyard, and along the steeply sloping corridor down to the gardens. He avoided the guards who tramped between the roses in the lowest terrace, and went out through a sally port that was locked by steel and spell. Fortunately, he had stolen the key for the lock, and the door knew him by his charter mark. Out in the lane that ran into the King's Road, he slung his surprisingly heavy saddlebags over his shoulder, and wondered whether he should have gone through them again and taken things out, because they were bursting at the seams. But he couldn't think of anything to leave behind, and he was taking just the bare essentials: a cloak, spare shirts, trousers, and underclothes, a sewing kit, a bag of soaps and toiletries with a razor he hardly needed to use, a copy of The Very Useful Guide, some friction matches, slippers, 2 gold bars, an oilskin square that could be used as a makeshift tent, a bottle of brandy, a piece of salted beef, a loaf of bread, 3 ginger cakes, and a few devices of his own making. Besides what was in the saddlebags, he'd only a broad-brimmed hat, a belt purse, and a fairly nondescript dagger. His first stop would be the Central Market to buy a sword, and then he would go to the horse fair at Anstey's Field for a mount. As he left the lane and stepped out into the King's Road to join the already rapidly building bustle of men, women, children, dogs, horses, mules, carts, beggars, and who knew what on the street, Sam felt a tremendous lift to his spirits, a feeling he hadn't had for years. It was the same sense of joy and expectation he'd felt as a child being given an unexpected holiday. Freed of responsibility, suddenly given license to have fun, to run, to scream, to laugh. Sam did laugh, trying a deeper chuckle to fit his new personality. It came out rather strained, almost a gurgle, but he didn't mind. Twirling his new charter-magicked mustache, he quickened his pace, off to adventure, and, of course, to rescue Nicholas. 3 hours later, most of his pre-dawn exuberance was gone. His guise as a traveler was very good for not being recognized, but it didn't help him get attention from merchants and horse traders. Travelers were not known as great customers, for they rarely had any coins, preferring to barter services for goods. It was also unseasonably warm, even for so late in spring, making the sword buying in the crowded market sweaty and unpleasant, with every second seeming to last an hour. The horse trading was even worse, with great swarms of flies settling on the eyes and mouths of man and beast alike. It was no wonder, Samuel thought, King Anstey had ordered the horse fair set up 3 miles from the city all those centuries ago. The fair had ceased during the years of the interregnum, but had begun to grow again in Touchstone's reign. Now the permanent stables, corrals, and bidding rings covered a good square mile, and there were always more strings of horses in the pastures that surrounded the horse fair proper. Of course, finding a horse that you wanted to buy among the multitude took considerable time, and there was always competition for the better horses. People from all over the kingdom, and even barbarians from the north, came to buy at the fair, particularly at this time of year. Despite the crowds, the flies, and the competition, Samuel came out of his 2 purchasing ordeals quite happily. A plain but serviceable longsword hung at his hip, its sharkskin hilt rough under his tapping finger. A somewhat nervous bay mare followed behind, constrained by a leading rein from giving in to her neuroses. Still, she seemed sound enough, and was neither too noticeable nor expensive. Sam was toying with calling her Tonin, after his least favorite guard, but he decided that was both childish and vindictive. Her previous owner had, somewhat enigmatically, called her Sprout, and that would do. Once out of the stink and crowding of the horse fair, Sam mounted up, weaving Sprout through the steady stream of traffic, finding his way past carts and peddlers, donkeys with empty panniers going away from the city, and those with full ones going in, gangs of workmen relaying the stone pavers of the road, and all the nondescript journeyers in between. Not far out of the city, he was overtaken by a king's messenger on a black thoroughbred that would have set the buyers bidding furiously at the fair, and then later by a quartet of guards, setting a pace that could be maintained only in the knowledge that fresh horses awaited them at every posting house on the road. Both times, Sam slouched in the saddle and pulled his hat down to shadow his face, even though the glamour still held. With the help of the very useful guide, Sam had already decided on his first stop. He would take the narrow way along the isthmus that joined Belisir to the mainland, because there was no other way to go. Then he would take the high road south to Orchire. He had considered going west to Sendal and then to the Raderlin, where he could take a boat as far as Quire, but the very useful guide mentioned a particularly good inn at Orchire that served a famous jellied eel. Sam was partial to jellied eel, and saw no reason why he shouldn't take the most comfortable way to Edge. Not that he was entirely sure what the most comfortable way would be after Orchire. The Great South Road followed the east coast most of the way down, but Edge was all the way across on the west coast, so he would have to cut west sooner or later. Perhaps he could even leave the Royal Roads, as they were called, and cut cross-country from Orchire, trusting that he would be able to find country roads that would take him in the right direction. The danger in that lay in the spring floods. The Royal Roads mostly had decent bridges, but the country roads did not, and their usual fords might be impassable now. In any case, that was all in the future, and not to be worried about until after Orchire. The town was 2 days' steady riding away, and he could think about his next stage en route, or that evening, when he planned to put up in some inn. But planning the next stage of his journey was the last thing on Samuth's mind when he finally reached a village and a staging inn that could be considered far enough away from Belisir to stop. He'd ridden only 7 leagues, but the sun was already setting, and he was exhausted. He'd had too little sleep the night before, and his backside and thighs were reminding him that he'd hardly ridden all winter. By the time he saw the swinging sign that declared the inn's name to be the Laughing Dog, he could do little more than tip the ostler to look after Sprout and collapse on a bed in the best room in the house. He woke several times in the night, the first to kick off his boots, and the second to relieve himself in the bedpan, with a broken lid, thoughtfully provided by the inn. The third time he woke, it was to insistent knocking on the door, and the first rays of sunlight slipped through the shuttered windows. "Who is it?" groaned Samuth, sliding out of the bed and into his boots. His joints were stiff, and he felt awful, particularly in his slept-in clothes, which smelled dreadfully of horse. "Is it breakfast?" There was no answer save more knocking. Grumbling, Samuth went to the door, expecting some zany or village fool to grin up at him from behind a breakfast tray. Instead, he was greeted by 2 wide-shouldered men wearing the red and gold sashes of the rural constabulary over their leather cuirasses. One, clearly the senior, carried some authority in his stern face and silver, short-buzzed hair. He also had a charter mark on his forehead, which his younger assistant did not. "Sergeant Cuke and Constable Tepp," announced the silver-haired man, thrusting past Samuth quite roughly. His companion also pushed in, quickly closing the door after him, and letting the bar fall back in place. "What do you want?" asked Sam, yawning. He didn't intend to be rude, but he had no idea that they had an interest in him, and had knocked on his door by choice rather than chance. His only previous experience with the rural constabulary was seeing them on parade, or inspecting some post of theirs with his father. "We want a word," said Sergeant Cuke, standing close enough that Sam could smell the garlic on his breath and see the marks where he'd scraped the stubble off his chin not long before. "Let's be beginning with your name and station." "I'm called Sam. I'm a traveler," replied Samuth. his eye following the constable, who had moved to the corner of the room and was examining his sword propped against the saddlebags. For the first time, he felt a twinge of apprehension. These constables might not be the clodpoles he thought. They might even discover who he was. Unusual for a traveler to be staying at a posting inn, let alone the best room in the house, said the constable, turning back from Sam's sword and saddlebags. Unusual to tip the ostler a silver denier, too. Unusual for a traveler's horse not to have a brand or clan tokens in its mane, replied the sergeant, talking as if Sam wasn't there. It'd be pretty strange to see a traveler without a clan tattoo. I wonder if we'd see one on this laddie if we looked. But maybe we should start looking in those bags, Tep. See if we can find something to tell us who we've got here. You can't do that! Exclaimed Sam, outraged. He took a step towards the constable, but stopped abruptly as sharp steel pricked through his linen shirt, just above his belly. Looking down, he saw a poniard held steadily in Sergeant Cuke's hand. You could tell us who you really are and what you're up to, said the sergeant. It's none of your business! Exclaimed Sam, throwing his head back in disdain. As he did so, his tousled hair flew back, revealing the charter mark on his forehead. Instantly, Cuke called out a warning, and the poniard was at Sam's neck, and his right arm pinioned behind him. Of all things the constables might fear, the bearer of a false or corrupted charter mark was one of the worst, for he could only be a free magic sorcerer, a necromancer, or something that had taken human shape. Almost at the same time, Tep opened a saddlebag and lifted out a dark leather bandolier, a bandolier of 7 tubular pouches that ranged in size from a pillbox to a large jar. Wooden handles of dark mahogany thrust out of the pouches, making it quite clear what the bandolier held. The bells that Sabriel had sent to Samoth, the bells that he had locked away in his workroom, and definitely hadn't packed. Bells! Exclaimed Tep, dropping them in fright and leaping back, almost as if he'd drawn out a nest of writhing serpents. He didn't notice the charter marks that thronged upon the bandolier and handles. A necromancer, whispered Cuke, and Sam heard the sudden fear in his voice and felt the hold on him slackening, the poniard drifting away from his throat, the hand that held it beset by sudden shivering. In that instant, Samoth pictured 2 charter marks in his mind, drawing them from the endless flow like a skilled fisherman, selecting his catch from a glittering shoal. He let the marks infuse into his held breath. Then he blew them out, at the same time throwing himself to the ground. One mark flew true, striking Tep with sudden blindness. But Cuke must have been some small charter mage himself, for he countered the spell with a general warding, the air sparking and flashing as the 2 charter marks met. Then, before Sam could even get up, Cuke's poniard stabbed out, sinking deep into his leg, just above the knee. Sam screamed, the noise adding to Tep's shouts of blind despair as he groped around the room, and Cuke's even louder shouts of "Necromancer!" and "A rescue!" That would bring every constable for miles, and any guards who might be on the road. Even concerned citizens might come, but it would be brave ones, since the word necromancer had been heard. After the first split-second shock of pain, when his whole mind seemed to crack open, Sam instinctively did what he'd been taught to save his life in the event of an assassination attempt. Drawing several charter marks in his mind, he let them grow in his throat and roared out a death spell to strike everyone unprotected in the room. The marks left him like an incandescent spark, leaping to the 2 constables with terrible force. In a second, it was quiet as Cuke and Tep tumbled to the floor like broken stringed puppets. Sam pushed himself to his feet, the realization of what he'd done rising through the pain. He'd killed 2 of his father's men, his own men. They'd simply been doing their job, the job that he was afraid to do, protecting people from necromancers and free magic and whatever else. He didn't stop to think any further. The pain was coming back, and he knew he had to get away. In a panic, he picked up his bags, thrust the cursed bells back in, buckled the sword around his waist, and left. He didn't know how he managed the stairs, but a moment later he was in the common room, with people staring at him as they backed against the walls. He stared back, wide-eyed and wild, and limped through, leaving bloody footprints on the floor. Then he was in the stables, saddling Sprout, the horse blowing wide-nostrilled, eyes white with fear at the scent of human blood. Mechanically, he soothed her, hands moving without conscious thought. A year later, or in no time at all, or somewhere in between, Sam was in the saddle, kicking Sprout into a trot and then a canter, all the while feeling his blood washing down his leg like warm water, filling up his boot till it overflowed the rolled back top. Some part of his mind screamed at him to stop and tend to the wound, but the greater part shouted it down, wanting only to flee the scene of his crime. Instinctively, he headed west, putting the rising sun at his back. He zigzagged for a while to lay a false trail, then took a straight track through the fields towards a dark expanse of forest not too far ahead. He had only to reach it, and he could hide and tend his hurt. Finally, Sam reached the comforting shadow of the trees. He went in as far as he could and fell off his horse. Pain climbed up his leg, spiking all the way. The green world of the forest spun and lurched sickeningly, refusing to hold still. The morning light had gone from yellow to gray, like an overcooked egg. He couldn't focus on the healing spell. The charter marks eluded him, slipping from his mind. They simply wouldn't line up as they should. It was all too hard, easier to let go, to fall asleep, to drift into death. Except that he knew death, knew its chill. He was already falling into the cold current of the river. If he could have been sure of being taken under by that current, rushed through the cascade of the first gate and then onwards, he might have given in. But he knew the necromancer who'd burnt him was waiting for him in death, waiting for an abhorsen in waiting, too incompetent to manage the manner of his own passing. The necromancer would catch him, take his spirit, and bind it to his will, use him against his family, his kingdom. Fear grew in Sam, sharper than the pain. He reached for the charter marks of healing once more, and found them. Golden warmth grew in his weakly gesturing hands, and flowed into his leg, through the black and sodden trouser. He felt its heat rushing through, all the way to the bone, felt the skin and blood vessels knit together, the magic bringing everything back to the way it was supposed to be. But he'd lost too much blood too quickly for the spell to render him completely whole. He tried to get up, but couldn't. His head fell back, the leaf litter making him a pillow. He tried to force his eyes wide open, but couldn't. The forest spun again, faster and faster, and then everything went black. And that is the end of chapter 28. So I hope you enjoyed that reading. I will post chapter 29 tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And until then, I'm going to try to go and get some rest. I can feel my body going, it's time. It's time to take it easy. So I'm going to listen. Well, I guess I'll listen after I edit. But anyways, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Until tomorrow, take care. And as always, may your magic manifest. Bye.